Snow whispered across the rails like a secret too heavy to keep. The train, black with soot and shivering steam, crawled into Ridge Hollow as if reluctant to stop. Winter had swallowed the valley whole, every fence post a ghost, every pine a sentry dressed in frost. The air smelled of iron, coal, and something lonelier still. When the doors opened, a single woman stepped down, her gloved fingers trembling around a scuffed suitcase. Evelyn Marlowe. She stood small and rigid, a scrap of grace against the endless white. The townsfolk watched her with quiet curiosity, their breaths clouding in judgment. A mail-order bride arriving in the dead of winter was something to talk about. Calder Boone waited near the hitching post, his hat brim low, the snow collecting on his shoulders. He wasn't the sort to smile, but his eyes held a tired gentleness, the kind a man earns after losing more than he speaks of. When she met his gaze, he tipped his hat. "Darlin, I don't bite, promise." The words floated between them, soft as falling ash. She gave no reply, only nodded, clutching her suitcase tighter, as though language might betray her. They rode back to his ranch in silence. The wind pressed hard against them, howling through the bare trees. Calder's horse snorted plumes of mist while Evelyn's hands, hidden in worn mittens, clutched the saddle horn. She had never ridden this far from the sound of other voices. Once the lantern light caught his profile, stern jaw, a scar that ran like a pale thread down his cheek, and she turned away quickly, embarrassed by her own stare. By the time they reached the house, dusk had bled into night. The ranch stood alone on a ridge overlooking the frozen river, a shadow framed in pale smoke. Inside, the hearth glowed low. He showed her the small room off the main hall. Plain bed, a wash basin, a single window rimmed with frost. "Ain't much," he said quietly, setting down her trunk. "But it's warm, and it's yours." She nodded again. The words stuck somewhere behind her ribs. Calder hesitated in the doorway, unsure if she feared him or everything that came before him. "I'll be outside if you need anything," he said, then left her to the quiet. She sat on the bed, listening to the wind moan through the eaves. In that sound, she could almost hear the city she'd fled, its cruel laughter, its narrow rooms, the way men looked through her instead of at her. Downstairs, Calder stoked the fire. His movements were slow, practiced, as if time itself had stopped demanding much of him. Above the mantel hung a portrait, faded, tender, of a woman with kind eyes. His late wife. Evelyn noticed it when she came to fetch water and felt a chill deeper than the season itself. Days passed in measured silence. She rose early, swept the floors, tended to the hens, and avoided the mirror. Calder, true to his nature, spoke little. Yet each day he left something small for her. A mug of steaming coffee on the table, a shawl laid over the chair she favored, a path cleared through the snow to the barn. He never mentioned these gestures, and she never thanked him aloud, but both felt the quiet exchange for what it was, a fragile peace between strangers learning where to put their ghosts. When she finally ventured into town, the world grew smaller and colder all at once. Ridge Hollow was built from timber and pride. Its single street ran between a saloon, a blacksmith's forge, and a general store that smelled of flour and suspicion. The women by the post office glanced her way, whispering behind their hands. Mrs. Temperance Hargrove, draped in church black and pearls, called out to her sweetly, "We've not seen you before, dear. Come from St. Louis, was it? I hear they send all kinds of brides from there." Evelyn's cheeks flushed crimson against the snow. She murmured something polite and turned to leave, but her eyes caught a reflection in the window. Her own face, pale and unfamiliar, as if belonging to someone who hadn't survived the journey. Calder's voice cut through the murmurs behind her. "She's my wife," he said simply, his tone steady as oak. The whispers faltered, but the damage lingered. On the ride home, he said nothing more. She wished he would. That night, she sat by the fire, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. The silence between them thickened. "You don't have to defend me," she said finally. "They're not wrong to wonder." Calder looked up from the firelight, the shadows softening his face. "You're here," he said. "That's what matters." But his eyes betrayed something else. Fear, perhaps, of caring again. When the snow deepened, he began teaching her to ride. At first she refused, her body too small, her courage smaller. But he insisted gently, leading the horse by the reins, walking beside her in the frozen field. The world was quiet, except for the creak of leather and the crunch of hooves on snow. Her laughter, rare and shy, broke through the stillness when the horse snorted at the wind. "He's got opinions," Calder said, smiling for the first time since she'd met him. She lost her balance once, slipping off into the drift. Calder reached her in 2 strides, his gloved hand outstretched. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, unable to look up. His touch lingered a heartbeat too long before he let go. The warmth of it followed her back to the house. Later, by the glow of the lantern, she wrote him a note. Her handwriting trembled across the page. "Thank you for not asking who I was before. It's the kindest thing anyone's done." She left it by the hearth where he'd find it come morning. Then she stood at the window for a long while, watching the wind erase her footprints from the yard. In the barn, Calder read the note as dawn broke pale over the ridge. He folded it carefully, as though it were something fragile that might tear with breath. Outside, the horses stirred, their breath silver in the air. He thought of his wife's grave behind the orchard, the way he'd spoken to her there on lonely nights. "You'd laugh at me, wouldn't you?" he whispered to the cold. "Taking in another soul when I ain't fixed myself yet." Evelyn appeared at the barn door, her shawl wrapped tight, eyes shining with the early light. "You talked to her?" she asked softly. Calder didn't turn. "Sometimes," he said. "Old habits die hard." She stepped closer, her boots crunching the frost. "Maybe she'd want you to have someone to talk to." Their eyes met in that moment. No grand declarations, no promises, but something unspoken passed between them. Tender and cautious, like the first flame that dares to live after a storm. He nodded once, and she smiled. The smallest motion, but enough to shift the air around them. That night, the snow fell heavier than before, thick flakes spiraling against the window glass. Inside, the fire burned steady, its light flickering across their faces as they sat in silence. Calder mended a bridle. Evelyn stitched a tear in her dress. The world outside was endless white, but in that small cabin, warmth began to root itself quietly, like spring beneath frozen ground. The wind carried the faint whistle of the departing train, a lonely, faraway cry. Evelyn looked up from her stitching, listening until the sound faded. For a moment, she wondered if that whistle was calling her back to where she came from, to the pain and the shame she'd buried under snow. But she didn't move. The thought of leaving no longer filled her with relief, only sorrow. Calder caught her glance. "Cold out there tonight," he said. "Yes," she whispered, her voice nearly lost in the crackle of the fire, "but not in here." He didn't answer, just nodded once and added another log to the flames. The room glowed warmer, and the silence that followed was not empty, but full. Full of things neither dared to say, yet both somehow understood. Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the world in a hush so deep it felt sacred. Inside, two souls who had forgotten how to belong began to remember. And though neither would have admitted it, they both knew. Something had shifted. The winter no longer seemed so endless. Morning arrived pale and brittle. The sky cracked open with light that felt more like forgiveness than dawn. Evelyn stirred before Calder did, her breath faint clouds in the chill. The world outside glimmered with frost, every branch coated in glass. The quiet peace between them had begun to feel like something fragile but real, until the letter came. Calder found it in town, handed over by the postmaster with a curious look. He tucked it into his coat and didn't open it until nightfall, when Evelyn had already gone to bed. The paper smelled faintly of tobacco and rain. The words inside cut through him like sleet, a friend from Missouri writing to warn him, saying Evelyn Marlowe wasn't who she claimed to be, that she'd once been a servant accused of theft, a runaway hiding behind a new name. Calder read it twice, slow, the firelight dancing against his stubbled jaw. He folded the letter neatly, as though neatness could make its truth less cruel. The next morning he spoke little. Evelyn felt the change at once, the silence between them, once gentle, now sharp-edged. When she asked if he was unwell, he only said, "Just tired." But his eyes avoided hers, and that was answer enough. She spent the day mending curtains that didn't need mending. Outside, the snow began to melt around the eaves, dripping like a clock counting down to something she couldn't stop. By evening, Calder was still gone. His absence left the house hollow. She found the letter left open on the table, its words blunt and unkind. She read it once, her pulse drumming against her throat. Shame burned her cheeks. She had known this day might come. Lies never die quietly. When he returned, she was waiting by the fire, her hands clasped tight in her lap. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice low, almost unwilling to believe what he'd read. She didn't deny it. "It is," she whispered, "but I took nothing that wasn't mine. Only my chance to start again." He looked at her for a long moment, as though searching her face for proof of innocence or guilt, and finding both. Then he said nothing at all. He simply turned and walked out into the snow, closing the door behind him with a quiet that felt like finality. Evelyn stood there for a long time, listening to the wind press against the house. The fire cracked, sputtered, then dimmed. By morning, the town knew. Mrs. Hargrove's words spread quicker than wildfire on dry brush. The mail-order bride was a thief, a liar. Poor Calder Boone, fooled by another woman's soft eyes. Evelyn felt their judgment before she saw it. Whispers in the store, turned backs at church. She began to move through Ridge Hollow like a ghost, her chin lifted, but her heart heavy with dread. That night, she packed her trunk. The snow outside had hardened to ice, and the wind screamed down from the hills. She left her wedding ring on the table, beside a note written in trembling ink. "Thank you for kindness you didn't owe me. I'll trouble you no more." She had almost reached the barn when the storm broke. The wind tore at her coat, slicing through the seams. Lightning split the sky, quick and violent, revealing the outline of the barn in stark relief, and the smoke curling from its roof. She froze, disbelief stealing her breath. Then came the sound of horses shrieking, a terrible human cry underneath. Jed's voice, without thought she ran. Snow bit at her legs, her lungs burned. She pushed through the door just as flames roared to life, painting the rafters gold and red. Jed was trapped behind a fallen beam, his face streaked with soot, coughing hard. "Get out!" he choked. But Evelyn moved toward him, the heat searing her skin, the world spinning in light and ash. She grabbed the beam, tried to lift, it wouldn't budge. When Calder appeared in the doorway, wind and fire colliding around him, she shouted through the smoke, "Help me!" Together they hauled Jed free. Calder pulled him toward the open air, while Evelyn stumbled after, the hem of her dress catching flame. She fell into the snow outside, rolling, gasping, until the fire hissed and died against the cold ground. Calder knelt beside her, pressing his hand to her shoulder. His eyes were wide, terrified. "You could have died," he said, his voice raw. She looked up at him through tears that froze on her cheeks. "So could he," she whispered. "I couldn't let him burn." The barn collapsed behind them with a roar, sparks rising into the storm like stars torn from heaven. For a long moment, they sat in the snow, Jed coughing weakly nearby. The fire reflected in Calder's eyes. Then he turned to her, voice low, trembling. "I was a fool to doubt you, to think your past mattered more than what I've seen with my own eyes." She shook her head, shivering. "You had reason. Everyone does." "No," he said, taking her hand. Hesitant, reverent. "Not anymore." They stayed there until the fire dwindled to embers, and the storm softened to a whisper. The world seemed to exhale, exhausted but alive. Calder helped her to her feet, his hand firm around hers. "Come inside," he murmured. "You've done enough fighting for one night." When dawn came, the ranch stood scarred, but standing. Smoke drifted from the ruins of the barn, but the sky had cleared, pale blue stretching endlessly above the snow. Jed lay asleep in the parlor, bandaged and breathing steady. Calder sat by the window, watching the world thaw by degrees. Evelyn approached quietly, her shawl wrapped tight, her hair still smelling faintly of smoke. "I'll rebuild it," he said, not turning. "I can help." He glanced at her then, something soft flickering in his expression. "You already did." The days that followed were filled with quiet work. Together they cleared debris, mended fences, tended what animals remained. Each gesture between them felt newly born, stripped of pretense. The townsfolk came to help, their earlier judgment muted by the story spreading through the valley. The bride who'd run into the fire. Mrs. Hargrove arrived one morning with soup and awkward silence. Evelyn took it with a polite nod, neither forgiving nor condemning, only moving forward. The thaw came slow, but it came. The river broke first, ice cracking open to reveal dark water underneath. The fields softened. The air carried hints of pine and damp earth. Evelyn began humming while she worked, soft tunes from nowhere in particular. Calder listened from a distance, the sound warming places in him he thought forever frozen. One evening, they sat on the porch watching the sunset bleed gold into violet. The wind had lost its bite. Calder's hand rested on the railing beside hers, fingers brushing once, then staying. "You stayed," he said quietly, almost as if he couldn't believe it. Evelyn smiled, eyes on the horizon. "You asked me to." For the first time, he laughed. Not loud, but real, the sound carrying over the hills. In that moment, Ridge Hollow didn't feel like a place of exile anymore, but of return. The ghosts that had once filled the silence now felt like company instead of burden. As spring unfurled, the land began to heal. New foals stumbled in the pasture. The river sang again. The portrait above the hearth remained, but Calder no longer spoke to it. Some griefs do not disappear. They simply learn to live beside joy. Evelyn walked each morning to the hill overlooking the valley. Sometimes Calder joined her, sometimes not. Once she asked if he still doubted her. He looked at her for a long while before replying, I doubt plenty of things, Eve. Just not you. They said little after that. Words had done enough harm. Their silences were better, full, warm, alive. When the first blossoms appeared on the apple trees, Evelyn found herself writing again. Not letters of escape this time, but small notes left around the house. Boiled coffee for you by the stove. Don't forget your gloves. You looked happy today. Calder kept each one, folded in the drawer where the letter of accusation had once lain. And sometimes, on the coldest mornings before the sun had fully risen, he would whisper near her ear, "You saved us both, you know." She never replied, only leaned into his warmth until the world outside faded. Years later, an old voice might tell their story by a winter fire, perhaps Calder himself, older, slower, speaking to a grandchild or to no one at all. "If you ever find yourself lost," he would say, "remember, every winter carries its own mercy. Love don't always come like thunder or song. Sometimes it's just two people keeping each other warm till the thaw." And somewhere beyond that memory, snow would still fall quietly over Ridge Hollow, softening what the years had hardened, wrapping even the loneliest hearts in the same tender hush. If this story warmed you like a fire on a cold night, don't forget to subscribe for more Wild West tales.